Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.
I would assume we're all set. Good morning, and thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the Milwaukee Police Association. On behalf of the Milwaukee Police Association and our 1,600 members, we are truly honored to have with us today Governor Scott Walker. The Governor has demonstrated his support for law enforcement, but more importantly, his understanding and his willingness to explore ways to bolster our ability to keep this great state safe. He has initiated endeavors, supported laws that would position us, law enforcement, to be best situated to focus towards safer communities. Years ago, it's already been years, his truth in sentencing legislation illustrated he was committed to safer communities. Our officers, the members of the Milwaukee Police Association, and law enforcement officers throughout the entire state have a front row seat to the dangers, the damages, the pain. Families affected forever by the criminal element. There is no early release for a family permanently impacted by a lawless society. Just in the last 2 months, as I'm sure you all know, we have lost two of our heroes. Lives, opportunities, futures, all cut short due to a criminal element that often manipulates and dodges the prison system. We certainly should not make it easier for criminals. And yet the officers do not hesitate. Every day throughout this state, your officers badge up and hold evil at a distance. However, we need help. Believe it or not, some politicians propose agendas that make our job harder, including endeavors to release early or even argue that some lawless should not even be in prison. Prisoners deserve humane treatment, coupled with appropriate incarceration consistent with state law. In the simplest of terms, do the crime, do the full time. The Governor's commitment to safer communities has been obvious through his consistent actions. And again, an illustration of consistency, this Governor is standing up for Wisconsin residents, Wisconsin families, by speaking out against plans that would put them in danger, put our families in danger. Throughout the state, law enforcement supports Governor Scott Walker. We are grateful for that same level of support that comes back to us, that he gives us. Because of his focus, all state law enforcement maintains a greater opportunity to keep their community, their entrusted, safer. So with that, I welcome and I thank Governor Scott Walker for being with us today. Thanks, Mike.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure in your role as the president of the Milwaukee Police Association, and to you, to your board, to the leadership, to the members of the Milwaukee Police Association, and in particular to everyone associated with the Milwaukee Police Department. We thank you for what you and your members do every single day. As you alluded to, we know, obviously as all of us here know, the last few months this summer has been a particularly trying time for the members of the Milwaukee Police Department. Again, as we're here today, we certainly pause for a moment and think about the lives, the legacy, and the families and friends and coworkers of both officers Charles Irving Jr., who obviously was lost earlier this summer, and most recently Officer Michael J. Mahalski, and to their families and to their friends, and particularly to those men and women who work with them and continue to work to keep us safe here in Milwaukee. Again, our heartfelt condolences and our continued support. our support as well, not just for those men and women in the Milwaukee Police Department, but as Mike mentioned, to law enforcement across the state and really across the country. We begin by saying thank you. Today, and I appreciate you allowing us to be here today. It's in my own neighborhood, so it's just from around the corner. I used to be able to walk around the corner to stop on over here, and appreciated meeting with the members of the Milwaukee Police Association. Today we wanted to point out something that I think is fundamentally important, and it's something that I think is worth highlighting. It's been mentioned in various pieces, and I'm going to allude to some statements and some proposals that have been made, but I think it's fundamental to understand this is one of the clearest differences that people are going to face between now and November 6th when it comes to electing the next governor of the state of Wisconsin. When it comes to violent criminals in prison, I want to keep them in for their full term. Many of my opponents, many of the Democrats running for governor, want to let them out. I want to let them out early. And that, to me, is a fundamental concern. It transcends politics. It's far greater than whether you're Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative. Public safety is an issue that should concern everyone in this state. And that's why I wanted to draw attention to the statements and proposals that have been made and the contrast from the position I come from, as my friend President Crivello just talked about, something that's not something that's just recent, that's part of a long-standing tradition of supporting the men and women who serve us here and across the state, and in protecting our citizens, most particularly our families, our vulnerable, and our seniors. And so part of what I allude to here on my right and your left, there's been a lot of talk at the many different forums, and in a way I guess I should be glad that there have been so many forums because it reveals to the public exactly where the candidates stand on these issues. But if you look at least 4 of the candidates running for governor on the Democrat side, when asked about the proposal to cut the prison population in half, Tony Evers has said absolutely, and that's a goal that's worth accomplishing. Mike McCabe has said, first of all, our goal should be to cut our prison population in half, and we can do that. It's realistic and achievable goal. Kelda Roy said, by the end of my first term, we're going to have half the number of people incarcerated as we do today. And Kathleen Weinhold said, absolutely doable statistic. The reason I want to draw attention to that is because I think there's a bit of a myth going on, at least not only from the candidates, but some of the people they're trying to appeal to in the far, far, far extreme on the left side of the political spectrum, that somehow our prisons are full of people who are in merely for possession of marijuana. I want to set the record straight. In the most recent numbers from the Wisconsin Department of Corrections, that shows that that myth is just that. It doesn't match with reality. The reality is that 89% of all the people incarcerated, remember, 100% of the people in prison are felons, are convicted felons in the state of Wisconsin. 89% of the prison population today are in for crimes other than just drug-related crimes. Only 11% of the entire prison population in the state are in solely for drug-related crimes. And in that instance, we're talking about overwhelmingly examples of people who are drug dealers, who are involved in trafficking, who are involved in other things that I think many people in society would say it's reasonable that a court sentence them to time in prison as a public safety matter. But even if you just say drug-related crimes, it's only 11% that are in solely for that. Again, if you break down and look at the entire prison population, 2/3 are in for violent offenses. 2/3 of the offenders in the state prison system are in for violent offenses. And so if you just took out the other third, so it's a combination of drug-related offenses, again, although they're not just, most cases, they're for things like trafficking, dealing, other things that are significant concerns there. You have about 13% that are in for property-related crimes. That could be burglary, it could be car theft. Again, things that people find to be quite threatening as well, but not defined as a violent crime. And about 9% that are in for what's called public order. That could be driving while intoxicated, driving under the influence, things related to firearms. Again, things that people are obviously very concerned about, particularly for folks who may have been in and out of the prison system before. But even if you took and qualified those 1/3 of the prison population and said you were going to let them out, you still have to put almost 4,000 violent criminals out onto the streets if you're going to get to 50% of the prison population. And so I think this is dangerous. I think what they're proposing is dangerously liberal. It's based on a myth about the prison population. It's based on comparisons to other systems, either at the federal level and other states. And I got to tell you, as long as I'm governor, we're going to make sure that violent criminals serve the entire sentence that they were given by the court. And I want to add a few reasons why. President Crivello alluded to this, but years ago I worked with a good friend and a mentor of mine, former Governor Tommy Thompson, as I worked our way through leading the truth in sentencing legislation. And again, there's often talk about that. Truth in sentencing was not about longer sentences. It was about certainty in sentencing. And I'll tell you vividly why what persuaded me to be active in that movement was one particular instance, and then there were many others that followed, but one that I can still remember nearly 2 decades later, and that is I was in a hearing taking public testimony at the Brown County Courthouse. So we were up in Green Bay, Wisconsin, the Brown County Courthouse, and one of the people came to testify about the criminal justice system was a woman who had been sexually assaulted. This woman was traumatized, as obviously any of us would be, by a crime as violent and as awful as that. But she talked about how she was convinced by the people in the criminal justice system to go to court and face down the person who raped her so that that person could be found guilty and incarcerated and protect others from going through what she went through. And so as difficult as it was, as traumatic as it was for her to do that, she wanted to make sure no one else had to go through what she did. And so she went to court, she faced down her assailant, the court found that individual guilty, and ultimately a judge gave the individual a sentence in prison. And what she testified to me on that day, I still remember vividly today as though it was yesterday. She said, and then after the sentencing was done and I left the courtroom, I talked to the person who was assigned to help me, and the victim witness coordinator, and that person walked me through how this person could be paroled earlier and get out of prison sooner than the time that he was sentenced to. On that day, she told me she felt like she was victimized all over again. That here she had gone to court to ensure that he was going to be in for a fixed amount of time, only to find out that he could be let out on parole earlier, and at some point, 2/3 into his sentence, he was going to hit automatic parole, and he could arguably be out even sooner than that on some sort of work release. And it was clear to me at that time, not just for her, but for all the other victims I've talked to, for all the other officers who've talked to me about how they're willing to risk their lives to protect and serve the public they hold dear, to make sure that people are taken off the streets who've committed crimes, particularly violent crimes against victims here in Milwaukee and across the state, and that it is up to us. It is one of our fundamental responsibilities as elected officials, whether we serve at the municipal, the county, the state, or the federal level, to protect our citizens. And that in a case like that, part of that protection means that for everyone involved in the criminal justice system, from the judge to the jury, from the prosecutor to the attorneys involved, to the police officer, to the investigators, and most importantly to that victim, everyone should know that when that sentence comes down, they have the certainty of knowing that they can have peace of mind knowing that that individual, he or she, will be incarcerated for that full amount of time. That's why we did truth in sentencing. It wasn't to add time. It's up to the judges, based upon what they know at the time of sentencing, to determine what the sentence should be. It shouldn't be left up to a bureaucrat sometime later. It certainly shouldn't be left up to a politician who wants to make a play for political purposes in the primary to say that they're going to let violent criminals out on the streets, particularly when that commitment was made at the time of sentencing to the victim and everyone else in society, that was going to be the amount of time served. And so that's why I'm here today, to make it fundamentally clear. And you know, these are just a few of the faces out here of people who've committed serious crimes, who've been in and out of the prison system. There are many, many, many more examples like that across the state, but we don't want anybody left out early. To me, the best example of reform when it comes to our prison system is something we embarked on a few years ago and continue to build on today. And that is when we set money aside on our blueprint for prosperity to work with our technical college system here in Wisconsin to reach out and start providing technical and vocational training to individuals who are at or near the end of their sentence. To get them the training, we started out with CNC operators. We want to do it in other areas. We'd like to see that expand. That, to me, is the way you reform the system and you ultimately get to a lower prison population. It's not by letting people out early. It's by getting people training and skills so that once their entire sentence is completed and they're able to walk back out in freedom because they paid their debt to society, then we should give them the tools that they need to be able to find lawful employment, to live a life that keeps them out of the prison system and the criminal justice system going forward. To me, that's the much more viable approach. That's the much better form of prison reform than talking about letting violent offenders, violent criminals out of prison early here in the state of Wisconsin. So to me, this was an issue I thought was important to rise up. It's been talked about in the midst of a whole bunch of other forums. I know you guys have had so many different forums. For the Democrats, sometimes it gets a little overwhelming as to all the different issues that came up, but I thought this was worthy to point out. And again, to stress, when it comes to violent criminals in prison in the state of Wisconsin, I want to keep them in for their entire sentence. Many of my opponents on the other side of the aisle want to let them out early. And I think that's an important distinction that I don't care whether you're Republican or Democrat. I think that's an important distinction that the people in the state who want public safety, who want to feel safe in their homes, who want to feel safe in their communities, who want their children and their parents and grandparents to feel safe, that's an important distinction out there. So with that, I'll take questions if you got them.
Governor, some Republicans in the legislature have acknowledged this spring that the state needs to build another prison in order to reduce overcrowding. You have not said where you stand on that previously. So do you support building another prison, or do you support moving some inmates to private prisons?
From our standpoint, we'll make sure that we've got the space, ideally long-term. Like I said, we'd love to find ways to get people the training so that once they end their sentence, they're able to go out into society, to find gainful employment. At a time when we've got 5 months of sub 3% unemployment, the first time in our state's history, this is a perfect time to get people the skills and the training that they need. Anybody, but in particular, per your question, people who've been in the criminal justice system, the training they need to find employment that will keep them out of the system. So I think we can stabilize and slowly see a reduction in the prison system as we find people the skills they need for employment. I just don't think you do it by letting people out on early release. And in terms of what we may do in the future, excuse me, I don't want to prejudge. We've got a panel that we put together to look at not only space needs, but we've got 2 prisons in the state that are over 100 years old, and trying to figure out if those are the most efficient and effective use of resources and are the most effective and efficient places to operate. But no matter what the infrastructure needs are, again, as long as I'm governor, we're going to keep people in prison for the amount of time that they were sentenced to. We've given plenty of resources. We did it again this past legislative session. We've given plenty of resources to the courts for alternatives to incarceration. That was part of the HOPE agenda we did with Representative Nygren. We've done it in other instances in the budget in the past. So we want to find alternatives to incarceration so that when a judge and a jury and others are looking at sentencing, they're given as many different options for programming and alternatives and probation if that's what's necessary. But that's a decision that should be made up front, particularly with the victims and law enforcement and the criminal justice system involved. It shouldn't be something that's done on the tail end just because somebody, a politician, wants to meet some goal.
Have you visited any prisons? I know previously you said you hadn't visited
No.
a prison during your tenure.
I have not as governor.
If you're reelected?
No. To me, there's no value to me visiting. I've talked to plenty of folks who've been involved in the programs. So I have talked to offenders and been involved in some of the programs that we provide in terms of employment. But the prisons themselves are to me, there's people that we hire to run the correction system, and certainly will allow them to do their job.
Governor, can I ask you a related sort of question about your position on pardons for nonviolent offenders? You've not issued any. For example, we heard from a minister who was convicted of a lone drug offense 20 years ago, served his time, has turned his life around, but that one felony conviction has prevented him from becoming a chaplain in the military, getting job opportunities. He's written to you and gotten a blanket denial. Do cases like that warrant consideration?
I don't do pardons in simpler, because if someone's innocent, the criminal justice system has a process by which, and we've seen it used in the past, by which an individual can petition the courts to prove their innocence. If they were found guilty, then to me it's left up to the criminal justice system to decide what their intentions are at that time. Anytime, and you've got some people have advocates, others do not. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of people who've been through the criminal justice system in Milwaukee and elsewhere who don't have advocates for them seeking pardons. And to me, picking one versus another is something that I'm not going to do as long as I'm governor.
So you're starting in to talk about this now, but you don't have an opponent next week.
Well, it's because the whole slew of them. I mean, this is something they've all, each of these individuals, that's why we had direct quotes up there. I didn't want this to be lost in all the attention going into the primary on Tuesday. This is something that's come up now repeatedly at forums and interviews. It's something that got a slight mention along the way, but it hasn't been something that you all in the media and others have focused in on, and I think it's a big difference. I think there's not a bigger difference right now in terms of who the candidates are running for governor on the Democrat side and myself. This is about as clear-cut as it gets. If you believe that violent offenders should be let out early, then one of these candidates is probably your candidate. If you believe that violent offenders should serve the sentence that they were given, then I'm the only one on the ballot who's made that absolutely clear.
Some Democrats are out with criticism this morning saying you don't have the moral authority to talk about this because of the settlements involving Lincoln Hills, the lawsuits up there, the ballooning prisons budget. What's your response to that?
Again, the moral authority comes from the people of the state. The moral authority comes from law enforcement that we stand shoulder to shoulder with to say that we don't want to ever have a situation where a police officer, a sheriff's deputy, a state trooper, or anyone else carrying the badge in this state risk their life to protect and serve the people of their community, of their jurisdiction, and their state, bring somebody in who is a violent offender, someone who's committed a violent offense in this state, brings them in, goes through the criminal justice process. They're convicted by a jury of their peers and sentenced by a court, by judges duly elected and represented in a county in this state, and then a politician lets them out early. Particularly if it's not even for a program other than to say we should have half of them out. I mean, this is a frightful program. This is something that people should be concerned about, because there's this incredible myth out there by some on the far, far left in this state and in this nation that our prisons are somehow just filled with people who've had a mere possession of marijuana. That's just not the case. The data clearly shows in the state of Wisconsin that 2/3 of the offenders are in for violent offenses. You're talking about homicide, murder, rape, aggravated assault. These are many others on that list. These are the sorts of things that if someone is found guilty of that and sentenced to a fixed amount of time, I dare say I don't think there's anyone in this state, other than maybe these politicians, although I don't know that they would want them next door to them either, that wants somebody out early. Now, in terms of alternatives, the way to do it is at the end or at the beginning. We've given plenty of alternatives to incarceration for the courts. If they feel someone's been involved in a nonviolent offense and other activities, we give the courts plenty of opportunities to find alternatives to incarceration. That's something where they've got to take into account what they've heard from law enforcement, what they've heard from the victim, what they've heard from the rest of the criminal justice system. At the tail end, once someone's sentence is completed, we're more than willing, even as they get ready to be returned to society, to provide the kind of training and assistance so that individuals who have paid their debt to society can be in a position where they can find employment, they can find a career, they can find a path that keeps them from repeating. I want that. I'd love to have the entire prison population wiped out entirely if it was because more people had found ways to go forward without committing crimes, particularly violent crimes in the state. But just cutting it in half is dangerous. And it means you're talking about just today, and this is a trend that isn't just today, it's not like it's accelerated, this is a trend that's been around for decades. If you were to cut it in half today, you'd have about 4,000 violent offenders released from the state of Wisconsin's prison system. Sure.
Here we are a week before the primary. You don't have a Democratic opponent yet, but you're attacking several Democrats on this issue. Could you talk broadly about how close you expect this race to be in the fall?
Sure.
And what issues you expect to be running on? And is this a sign that the issue set is going to be different than perhaps it was 4 years ago when you ran, like taxes and other issues?
Sure. Well, in terms of who we have, our biggest opponent's going to be none of these names, none of the 8. It's going to be Eric Holder, George Soros, Tom Steyer, all the millions of dollars that are already said they're coming into the state of Wisconsin. So we anticipate a close race. This is nothing new. I've said this for almost a year, that we expect this is going to be a close race. You know, when Eric Holder got involved in a state Supreme Court race where he's never been involved in Wisconsin State Supreme Court races before this spring, that was a pretty telling sign that they were targeting the state of Wisconsin, not only because they want to take me out, because there's a competitive U.S. Senate race, and this is a battleground state when it comes to the presidency. And so for all those reasons, there's a flush of outside money that's coming in to take us on. This is a competitive state. This is a state where a Democrat typically starts with about 48% of the vote. That's not anything new to me. You know, George Bush and John Kerry and George Bush and Al Gore were, I think, in that first race in 2000, it was an average of 1 vote per ward difference between Bush and Gore. And so this is just a competitive state. There's about an equal number of Republican and Democrat-leaning voters, and there's a small sliver of independents in the middle. And so we're going to start Wednesday of next week. We're going to lay out in detail our plan for the next 4 years. It's a simple concept. We're going to talk about how we're going to keep Wisconsin working for generations to come. We're going to lay out plans that tie into something I've talked about a lot already in the campaign trail, and that is I've got 2 sons in their 20s, both of whom live and work here in the state of Wisconsin, both of whom previously for a little while had left to find employment elsewhere and came back. A decade ago, before I was governor, so many of our graduates were going to other states to find employment, to pursue careers. We've turned that around. Today, there are more career opportunities than there are people to fill those jobs. And so we're going to talk about the things that help us keep more of our graduates here, that help us attract more millennials here, that help make this attractive for retirees to retire here and still participate and mentor here. We're going to lay all those things out next week. But before all that happens, the reason why we're laying this out today is there cannot be a starker contrast between me and a number of the Democrats running for governor in this state than this particular issue, and it's kind of been lost. It's kind of been lost in all the shuffle and all these other issues, and yet to me, and again, this is not something I've come to lately. If you go back to my involvement in truth in sentencing and other areas, we've always stood up and said, on behalf of the victims, on behalf of law enforcement officers, on behalf of the public as a whole, criminals, there should be certainty about the amount of time that a felon serves in prison. And we particularly want to make sure that society is safe from violent offenders. And the plans that they're talking about that would release half the prison population using today's statistics would absolutely require that thousands of those people let loose. The only way to get there would be violent offenders.
The 50% number aside, even if it's 11% nonviolent offenders, should we be doing something to reduce that population to free up space in the prisons, to unclog the courts?
To me, the way to do it is the 2 ends. I don't think you do it by saying to a victim, to a law enforcement officer, to the public, 5 years, 10 years, 2 years, I don't care what it is. Everybody in prison's in for at least a year or more. You don't become, you're not convicted of a felony conviction in the state of Wisconsin if you're spending less time than that. To be in the state prison system, you have to be a convicted felon, whether it's a year or 40 years. My opinion and what I've heard over the years, not just from Republicans, but from independents and even some Democrats across the state, is victims, society as a whole, law enforcement, all deserve the certainty of knowing that if someone is sentenced to a year, to 2 years, to 5 years, to 10 years, to 20 years, to 40 years, that should be the amount of time that they're sentenced to. It shouldn't be done arbitrarily because of some budget concern or some political agenda. It should be something that is sacred to know that if you spent that, if you were sentenced to that amount of time, that's what you sentenced to. In terms of how do you get to that point that you asked about, Kent, in terms of lowering the population, you do it either end. You give more alternatives to incarceration so that up front, when judges, law enforcement, prosecutors, and most importantly victims are involved, they can come to a point where if people do certain things, they'll say, well, we'll adjust the incarceration or the sentence at that point. If people are involved in that and they understand that makes sense. And then at the other end, I think one of the things we've started doing a few years ago will be effective as we continue to do it even more, is giving people the skills and training they need so once their sentence is complete, they find a career that sets them on a path so they're not down there again. Sure.
So a few months ago, you tweeted about concerns about a blue wave and warning your colleagues about the possibility of a blue wave. Is there going to be a blue wave?
Well, we're doing our best to tide it. I've said nationally, I think there's that sentiment out there. We saw it in a couple special elections. We've seen since then, in June, for example, there were 2 legislative elections. One was barely won by a Democrat. One was won by a significant margin by a Republican. I think that goes back to what I've said all along, and that is we've got a positive story to tell. We've got record high levels of employment, record low unemployment. We've cut taxes over $8 billion. We put more actual dollars into education in the state of Wisconsin than ever before. We froze tuition 6 years in a row. We have the #1 ranked healthcare systems in the nation for quality, and we've helped nearly 30,000 people transition from welfare into the workforce. We got a great story to tell. And starting next Wednesday, we're going to lay out our plans for the next 4 years about how we help Wisconsin keep working for generations to come. If we lay that plan out and we make those connections and we get organized and we knock on more doors and make more phone calls than we've ever done before, I'm absolutely confident that the state's heading in the right direction and that voters will want to continue to do that. But we're going to lay out the contrast. I think it's completely legitimate when people have said these things on the campaign trail to point out the distinctions, and we'll be doing that on other issues as well, but this is one of the most clear distinctions out there. If you're concerned about public safety, and Mike Crivello knows this because we hear this from the city council here in Milwaukee. We hear it when we go out in the streets. We hear it from officers. Alderman Donovan in particular has come and visited me multiple times here to talk about public safety, to talk about what more we can do to partner. It's why we did we've done a couple partnerships even for the program to track firearms, shots that go off with ShotSpotter programs we invested in, and other programs like that here specifically in Milwaukee, because we want to help lower the rate of crime in the city of Milwaukee, in this region and across the state. But you can't do that if you're letting violent criminals out, violent offenders out, some 50% of the population out. That's just not the right recipe going forward. So we're going to lay out distinctions for sure.
Folks, we got time for about one more here.
Okay.
I want to ask you about fundraising. Any thoughts on why your figures this cycle lag behind what they were 4 years ago?
Well, one, we're way ahead of everybody else, but I think it's simple. It's that people, and I've said this as well for the last almost a year, one of my big concerns was complacency. Complacency in terms of voters who say, hey, life's good. The state's never been better in terms of the economy. Things are heading in the right direction. We got nothing to worry about. Who say you won this election before. But we thought that would be true of voters. That would be true of activists and be true of donors as well. I still get people who say to me, honest to God, I've actually had people say to me, do you even have an opponent? And so they don't, when I talk about not just these names, but the 8 out there, I've been amazed that I still bump into people who don't even know that there are Democrats running against me. We're going to make clear the contrast going forward, but I think that's just part of it. People don't yet fully recognize and appreciate that we have a race, and in the state of Wisconsin, any competitive race is just that. It's a competitive race, and we expect it will be all the way through November 6th.
What vetoes are you considering for Kimberly Clark?
I don't even have a bill yet.
Okay.
No, so any talk about veto, I've never talked about vetoes with about Kimberly Clark before, so I'm not quite certain where that came from.
We'll have to wrap it up here, guys.
Great, thanks everybody. Thanks, Mike.
Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel.